two aims. One is to remember what Jesus did for us, because the Passover was on Tuesday night, and so Jesus has been through his crucifixion and resurrection. So that's one aim. The second aim is Forerunners has got a mandate this year to overcome mocking. So I'm going to continue to look at that today, a different way than Lynn looked at it a couple of months ago. And I'm going to start in the Old Testament. So I'm going to look at the content of one of the great prophecies in Zechariah. Zechariah 6, verses 12 to 13. This is one of those prophecies where God tells the people who this Messiah is that he's going to send his people. So we're going to look at the content of it. But before we look at the content, I'm going to give you some background, because you can see more of who God is and how loving and kind he is if you see the context in which he gives these prophecies. So Zechariah was sent by God to prophesy to the remnant who had returned to Jerusalem after the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And it was a remnant because God stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, to release the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem. And their aim was to rebuild the temple, and not many agreed to go. They wanted to stay behind because they built up a nice life in Babylon. They didn't want to leave it. So it was only a remnant who went back to Jerusalem. And when they got back there, they already knew this, but the city was in ruins, the walls were down, and the temple of Solomon's temple had been destroyed. So it wasn't really a great place for them to return to. But they believed in God, they were faithful, so they went back there, this remnant. But God told them to, first of all, to rebuild the temple. When they tried to rebuild it, they were intimidated by the nations surrounding them, so they stopped work. They worked for 2 years, but the intimidation was too much for them, so they stopped work, and for 14 years they weren't doing anything regarding this temple. And that put them in disobedience to God. They actually fell into iniquity. They became demoralized, and this is when God sent Zechariah in to speak to his people. He sent Haggai as well, but I'm focusing on this prophecy in Zechariah. So Zechariah was a prophet of restoration, and his message to the people was, return to the Lord, turn away from your evil ways and your evil deeds. So turn back to God was the first message that Zechariah gave to them. And so God offers this amazing prophecy, which we're now going to look at. And if you think about it, it's what the people needed most. They needed a Messiah, but it's what they least deserved. And this always touches me when I come across it in the Old Testament. God is merciful in the Old Testament as he is in the New Testament. And this is a great example of that, because he sent Zechariah to speak to people who were in iniquity. And God would have been angry at that. He's always angry at sin. He can't help it. He can't agree with it. He's angry with it. So we'll start in Zechariah 6, verse 12, and I'll just read it and offer my interpretation, which I must give Matthew Henry some credit, because I read him and I find him very illuminating, so these ideas aren't mine, they're actually his. I'm bringing them back to life, okay? So it says in verse 12, behold, a man whose name is Branch, for he will branch out from where he is. You probably already know this, but branch is used to mean the Messiah. And a really good example of this is Isaiah 11, verse 8. It comes up in Jeremiah as well. And I just want to explain to you that it says the branch will come out from where he is. Where he is in a dry place. The family, the house of David, the Israelites, They're the root from which the branch was going to come, but it's a very dry place, yeah? And I would also say that when Jesus came, that was a very dry place, dry ground where the root was, and the branch would come out. So what God's saying is that this fruitful branch will spring out of this not very nice place, this dry ground place. And it would grow up out of it his own vitality. It wouldn't draw from the dry place, will it? And he'd be exalted in his own strength. Jesus is standing alone in his own strength. He doesn't draw it from that root which is coming out of. Okay, and then it goes on in verse 12. And he will build the temple of the Lord. The Israelites have been asked to rebuild the earthly temple, but when it comes to the spiritual temple, Christ will be the sole builder of it. That's what that says. It says, he will build the temple of the Lord. And then we'll go on to verse 17. He will bear, in some translations it says honor, but I think glory is better. He will bear the glory. So glory, as you know, is a weight. You know, it's a weight to carry, it's a burden. And what this scripture is saying is that it won't be too heavy for Jesus. He'll bear the cross, that's one of his glories. He'll bear the government on his shoulders. And it says in Haggai, he'll bear the greater glory of the latter house. He'll have a crown of exceeding weight of glory. All of this is not too much for Jesus to bear. So if you think of where those people were, and this is the prophecy they're receiving, it's amazing, isn't it? This is what God comes and tells his people when they're in a demoralized state. They've failed to rebuild the temple. They're in disobedience. And he says, I'm going to give you this Messiah like you have never imagined. I mean, it is an amazing picture. Okay, going on in Zechariah 6:13. He will sit and rule on his throne. He will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the two offices. Now, this is what I really want us to look at. This means that Jesus will be the king, right? He's on a throne, and he will be the great high priest. Now, these two offices were held separately in the nation of Israel. So we had the house of David had the throne, the king, and the house of Aaron had the great high priest. In this prophecy, God is saying they will be united in Jesus. Okay? The third office in the Jewish nation was prophet of God, which assisted the other two offices. And as we know, but it isn't in this prophecy, Jesus was the greatest of prophets. So, the Messiah Zechariah is describing here will save through his office of high priest. He'll defend his kingdom as King of Kings. And he'll service both of these purposes through his office as prophet. He will be all three of them. And this is the great undertaking or plan of man's reconciliation to God, which he's doing through Jesus. And it said earlier on that the council of peace will be between the two offices. So there's not going to be any tension or friction because the offices are all united in Jesus. Yeah, isn't that beautiful? Absolutely gorgeous. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to offer you that prophecy is that this plan is mocked by the evil one as Jesus makes his way to the cross. So we want to look at how this is mocked. And if you go to Matthew 26, verse 68. The context here is that Jesus is being brought to the high priest Caiaphas by the scribes and elders. They're determined to have him murdered, but because they haven't got the right to carry out capital punishment, they have to charge him with blasphemy so that they can then hand him over to the Romans, who will then say, yes, we'll have him murdered. So that's what they're doing. They want to charge him with blasphemy, under Caiaphas, and then they'll hand him over to the Romans. So in this passage, they've already charged him, and Caiaphas has allowed the crowds to spit in his face, this is verse 67, beat him with their fists and slap him. Now at this time, it doesn't say it in Matthew, but in Mark 14:65, they've blindfolded him, so he can't see at this time. And so in Matthew 26, verse 68, it said, the crowd says, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you?" So they're mocking his office. He's blindfolded. They're saying, "Come on, you're a prophet. Tell us who's hit you." This is so. This is the way that they. Can you see how they're challenging him? They're making Mary by profaning this aspect of who he is. You know, this is his identity. He's the greatest prophet, and they're saying, "Come on, prophesy this to us." It's outrageous, really. So there we have them mocking the office of the prophet, and they're working through, the evil one's working through them, because, you know, Zechariah has said this is his office and he's already moved in it, and so he's coming to attack him in that way. You know, it's a high spiritual thing that's going on here. Next we see his office of King of Kings being mocked, and this is in Matthew 27, verses 28 to 31. At this point, he's been handed over to Pilate. Pilate's caved into the demands of the Jews, and so Jesus is going to be crucified. He's been handed over, and at this point, the Roman cohort has surrounded him. There's between 500 and 1,300 soldiers. And in Matthew 27, verse 27, they strip him, and in Matthew 28, they put a scarlet robe on him. Now, this is an imitation of the scarlet robes worn by kings at that time. It's a sham majesty that they're clothing him in, you know, to make fun of him. And they make him look ridiculous to the crowds, because he's in this robe, and then in verse 29, they put a crown of thorns on his head, which there's a lot more I could say about that crown of thorns, but I'll stick to what we're talking about here. So they put the crown of thorns on his head and a reed in his hand. Both of these are mock signs of his royalty, which they're bestowing upon him. How dare they? And they're making sport of him in this way. And then they bow the knee to him, and they mock him. They make him a sham king, and then they make a jest of paying homage to him. You know, they bow the knee to him. Everyone is going to bow the knee to Jesus eventually, but they're mocking this by bowing the knee to him in his robes of red and his crown of thorns and his reed, which is supposed to be his staff. So they're ridiculing his claims of sovereignty. Then in verse 30 they carry on. In those days the king's subjects were to kiss the sovereign. So instead of kissing Jesus, they spit in his face. And can you imagine spitting in the face of the one who outshines the sun? I mean, who do they think they are? And then they take the reed and they beat him on the head. And this is probably to make his wounds from the crown deeper. And it's obvious that his pain is a pleasure to them, so they're increasing it as much as they can. And then in verse 31, they take the robe off him to signify that they are divesting him of all the kingly authority that they had invested him with by putting it on him. But really, Jesus does have to, from a spiritual point of view, Jesus does have to wear his own clothing, because it's him who takes on the sin, and it's him who has to go through that. So That wouldn't have been God's plan for him to wear all this stuff that the soldiers had put on him. So there we have him being mocked for his office as king. The third office is his priestly office. So Matthew 27 verses 40 to 42. At this point, he's actually on the cross, being crucified with the two robbers on either side. And as he's on the cross, there's a rabble passing or standing there while Jesus is on the cross, and they demand that he save himself. They say, if you are the Son of God, then you should come down from the cross. And then in verse 27, verse 42, the chief priests, scribes, and elders were the ones that made sure that he found himself in this position. That wasn't good enough for them. They were so full of malice that they had to come along here and continue to mock him, join in this abuse. So they say in verse 42, if he saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. So they're setting up an agenda of their own. You know, you show us a sign that we want to see, and then we can believe you. In fact, Jesus was not going to come down from the cross. He had to die to save us. So whatever they said, whatever sign they demanded, it wasn't going to happen. They also intended to make bystanders see him as a deceiver and as an imposter, you know, because he claimed to be able to save, and they wanted everyone to see that actually had no power to save. So they're accusing him of being a liar and an imposter. So do you see how the evil one uses mockery to try to destroy the identity of Jesus on his way to the cross and while he's on the cross? It's a really, and then do you see how the impact of that mockery? Well, actually, it had no impact whatsoever on what Jesus actually did, because he died. He went down into the grave. He took the keys of Hades, he rose back up, and he conquered death, and he is now sitting on the right hand of the Father. So what the devil did there, using all those people, the scribes, the elders, the rabble, everybody, all the people who shouted Hosanna when he came into Jerusalem, used all those people to put him to death, had no impact whatsoever. In fact, it was God's plan. And I want to say to you that there's an implication for us, all of those who know who we're called to be, or who are already walking in what we're called to be, that we can actually expect this kind of mockery, but it can't overcome and destroy us. You know, however Satan may try to get to you, we have the victory. So if you have those negative words going around your head, or you look at the past and you're disappointed, or you haven't achieved what you wanted to, or people don't recognize you, or your leader doesn't see you after the Spirit, none of it matters, because you have the victory. You'll suffer tribulation, but Jesus has conquered the world. And so I would say, look at what Jesus went through and know that what you're called to, what God has told you you are, and who you're moving in, that's the truth. It's none of this. And Jesus knew that, and he's our great example. And so